Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something so chaotic, so absurd, and so catastrophically influential that it somehow involves chemistry, capitalism, and your uncle, who insists he totally remembers the 80s. Yes, tonight we're exploring the complete history of crack cocaine, a substance so infamous that it managed to turn baking soda, that innocent pantry item you use to de-stink your fridge, into the molecular equivalent of a Molotov cocktail. But before we get too comfortable wandering through one of history's messiest stairwells, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark, soothing chaos. And thank you for suggesting this topic. Your ideas shape these stories more than you know. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you too, because statistically at least 3 of you are listening at exactly 2:47 a.m, confidently pretending you're absolutely going to fall asleep any minute now. Now dim those lights, click on a fan for that gentle white noise, sink into your pillow, and tuck your feet safely under the blanket so no imaginary 1980s alleyway raccoons nibble your toes. Before we jump in, let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered how a drug that started in secret labs and backroom deals somehow reshaped entire cities? Or why did the US government reacted to powder and crack cocaine like they were completely different species, one treated like a fashionable butterfly and the other like a fire-breathing dragon? Or how the media turned the drug war into the most dramatic, fear-based television program of the decade, without ever airing a season finale? Or how many kitchen experiments went horribly wrong before someone said, yes, we should definitely smoke this? And most importantly, how did all of this begin with a plant so ancient that ancient civilizations were basically chewing cocaine leaves like medieval peasants chewed sadness? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in the early 1970s, an era of disco, questionable decisions, and chemistry that absolutely should have stayed in the lab, and you, my friend, are about to witness how a legal stimulant used for altitude sickness slowly mutated into one of the most infamous epidemics in American history. Get comfortable. Things are about to get weird in a soothing way. Long before neon lights and policy nightmares, you find yourself in the mountains of the Andes, where coca leaves are less a scandal and more a daily survival tool. You, like everyone around you, chew them to breathe at high altitudes, to work longer and to stay alert. Sort of like caffeine, but without the barista asking your name wrong. It's early morning and the wind slicing across the mountains feels like someone set the air to extra spicy. Your lungs protest the thin atmosphere, but the locals, they're casually trekking along cliffs in sandals made of woven fibres, humming to themselves as if gravity is merely a suggestion. You try to keep up. Spoiler, you can't. Your heart is pounding like a drum that has never known peace, and before you dramatically lie down and accept your fate, an elder quietly hands you a handful of bright green leaves. No fanfare, no instructions, just a look that says, "Trust me." We've been doing this for 5,000 years. You pop the leaves into your cheek, expecting them to taste like minty salvation. Instead, it's more leafy, earthy, somewhere between green tea and chewing on your front lawn. But then something shifts. Your breathing gets easier, your head clears, and suddenly the mountain that moments ago felt like a personal attack becomes slightly more manageable. Not easy, just less rude. Let's talk about why this leaf mattered so much. Up here, you're living at altitudes that would make modern hikers write strongly worded Yelp reviews about oxygen. The coca plant became the secret ally of everyone, from farmers to warriors to messengers sprinting from village to village. They chewed the leaves for stamina, clarity, and a little extra "please don't let me die on this cliff" path to day motivation. You can almost hear the ancient endorsement. Side effects may include productivity, alertness, and realizing you haven't blinked in 12 minutes. But coca isn't just a pick-me-up. It's woven into daily life like a cultural Swiss Army knife. Need to make a long trek? Chew coca. Need to trade with another village? Bring coca. Need to ask the gods for rain, a good harvest, or for your cousin to please stop borrowing your llama without asking? Offer coca, its currency, medicine, ritual, snack, and social glue, all wrapped into one extremely efficient little leaf. You notice this when you sit with a small group resting on a sun-warmed rock ledge. Someone pulls out a woven pouch, beautiful patterns, deep colours, and passes it around. Inside, more coca leaves, shared without hesitation. It's the ancient Andes version of offering someone gum, except this gum helps you outrun altitude sickness and existential dread. As you chew, conversations drift around you. Weather, harvests, distant relatives, and the occasional gentle insult about someone's weaving skills. Everything feels communal, grounded, rhythmic. The leaves don't just keep you awake, they connect you to the moment, to the mountain, to everyone else chewing thoughtfully beside you. Let's talk flavour again. After a while, your mouth goes pleasantly numb, which is great unless you planned on giving a speech or flirting. The numbness is one of the reasons coca became a medicinal staple. Toothache? Chew coca? Stomach pain? Coca tea? Feeling faint? Coca? Need to perform a ritual for protection? Coca pile, right in the centre. It's basically the duct tape of ancient Andean life. If something was going wrong, someone would confidently say, "Hold on, I've got just the thing," and pull out a handful of leaves. But here's the thing, no one up here is snorting anything. No one's transforming the plant into a powder, a paste, or anything resembling the disaster recipes you'll meet later in the script. The coca leaf is gentle, humble, borderline wholesome. You're chewing a plant that has been respected for millennia, handled carefully, used thoughtfully. It is the exact opposite of the substances it will one day unintentionally inspire, and as the sun dips behind the jagged peaks and the air cools again, you take one last leaf, tuck it into your cheek, and feel a calm, focused warmth spreading through your chest. For now, you're part of the rhythm of the Andes, awake, breathing, and standing on a mountain that, against all odds, you're no longer mad at. Because before there was crack, before cocaine became chemistry's problem child, there was just a leaf. A quiet green leaf helping civilization stay awake enough to survive another day. It's the late 1800s, and you're watching European chemists isolate cocaine from coca leaves like proud parents unveiling a science fair volcano that can ruin lives. Doctors adore it. Freud's recommending it, and nobody seems concerned that everyone's heart rate has left the building. You're standing inside a laboratory that looks like someone mashed together a wizard's workshop and a mildly unsafe bakery. Glass tubes bubble, flasks hiss. A man with a spectacular moustache taps a beaker with the same confidence you use when pretending you understand your car's engine. Around you, scientists chatter excitedly about purifying the active alkaloid while accidentally discovering the chemical equivalent of rocket fuel for the human nervous system. You don't want to alarm them, but you're pretty sure the stuff they're holding could make a sloth debate philosophy at 3 a.m. Let's set the scene. Up until now, coca leaves were gentle companions of ancient people who chewed them the way modern folks sip coffee they've emotionally outgrown. But now the leaves have met industrial chemistry, and the chemists have met something they absolutely should not be this excited about. As one of them carefully drips the finished extract onto a glass plate, the room goes quiet. They stare at the shimmering crystals as if expecting them to start singing. They don't sing, they do something far more dangerous. They work. Suddenly, cocaine becomes the darling of European medicine. Doctors prescribe it the way parents today prescribe screen time, generously, and with absolutely no idea what's about to happen. Have a cough? Cocaine. Feeling tired? Cocaine. Need local anesthesia? Cocaine. Want to make your sinus infection feel like a thrilling ride through a neon tunnel of destiny? Cocaine. You watch physicians beam with pride as their patients return filled with alarming enthusiasm and no desire whatsoever to blink. And then there's Freud. Sigmund Freud, a man who will one day be known for analysing dreams and blaming everything on your mother, is currently pacing his study singing the praises of cocaine like it's the emotional support drug he never asked for but fully adopted. He writes essays calling it a magical substance, recommends it to friends, uses it on himself, and cheerfully mails it to colleagues like holiday fruitcake, except fruitcake won't dissolve your septum. You sit in a Viennese cafe watching him scribble notes in the manic handwriting of a man whose brain is using 500% more enthusiasm than nature intended. He insists cocaine can cure depression, alcoholism, and a variety of social awkwardness. You want to tell him this is not going to age well, but he's already back in his study, writing another letter about how alert and alive he feels. It's like watching someone brag about discovering fire while standing directly inside a wooden barn. Meanwhile, cocaine's popularity explodes across Europe and America. Pharmaceutical companies package it in lovely embossed tins, often with elegant lettering that screams harmless household essential rather than caution. May lead to conversations at speeds previously unknown to science. It becomes an ingredient in tonics, lozenges, inhalers, and, briefly and infamously, popular beverages. People begin carrying pocket-sized vials the way modern folks carry chapstick. Only chapstick doesn't make you reorganize your attic at 4 a.m. As cocaine's use spreads, so do the stories. Surgeons praise its numbing power. Opera singers claim it improves performance. Writers insist it sharpens creativity, though you notice their poems now include 12 extra metaphors and no punctuation. Europe is caught between fascination and complete denial, but no one wants to be the first person to point out that everyone is sweating more than usual. And you, standing on the sidelines of this powdered revolution, begin to feel that uneasy silence right before history realizes it's made a terrible mistake. Because this isn't just a scientific discovery, it's ignition. Pure, anxious, shimmering ignition. Chemists have opened the door to something big, and no one, absolutely no one, is prepared for the decades of chaos that will come running through it. By the time you leave the century, the lab still glows with pride, the crystal still gleams, and the scientists still smile as if they've improved the world. But you know better. They've just handed it a speed boost. You've arrived in early 20th century America, where cocaine is casually floating through tonics, throat sprays, and even energy drops your grandmother would have absolutely bought in bulk. You're surrounded by advertisements that feel like lies whispered politely. You stand in a bustling apothecary, watching as customers browse shelves with the calm confidence of people who have no idea what they're ingesting. Bottles gleam beneath soft gas lamps, each label printed with ornate lettering promising invigoration, clarity, or the wildly vague renewed vitality. You pick one up. The ingredients list reads like a Victorian dare. Alcohol, chloroform, sugar, and oh yes, cocaine, just a dash, a polite sprinkle, a little chemical pep to help you get through your day without collapsing dramatically onto a fainting couch. Cocaine, at this moment in history, is less a drug and more a lifestyle accessory. The pharmacist cheerfully recommends it the way someone today might recommend essential oils, except this oil doesn't just open your sinuses, it opens your soul and politely ejects your sense of moderation. Mothers use cocaine throat lozenges to soothe their scratchy voices. Factory workers take cocaine tablets to stay awake during 12-hour shifts that definitely violate several labour laws that have not yet been invented. Even children's cough syrups get a little boost, turning bedtime into something between a medical procedure and a carnival ride. Let's talk packaging for a moment. Every bottle is adorned with gentle illustrations, mountains, flowers, smiling babies, absolutely none of which are accurate representations of what's happening inside. You lift a small tin of cocaine toothache drops, and the instructions suggest applying them liberally. You can practically hear the whisper of the early 1900s. If 1 drop makes you feel better, imagine what 10 will do. Across the aisle, you find a pocket inhaler promising to clear the mind and invigorate the nervous system. It does, a little too effectively. Outside the shop, the streets pulse with invention and noise. Automobiles chug their way into existence, skyscrapers scrape the sky, and America is buzzing, both metaphorically and, in many cases, chemically. You wander past posters featuring well-dressed women confidently declaring their love for pharmaceutical miracles. One reads, "For fatigue, melancholy, and the burdens of life, try our invigorating tonics." Another promises relief from nervous exhaustion, which you suspect is the era's polite term for raising 4 children before coffee was widely available. Doctors adore cocaine. They use it as a local anesthetic, a stimulant, and a catch-all remedy for the vague diagnoses of the time: hysteria, nervous temperament, low spirits, and the blues. It's prescribed with such casual frequency that you begin to question whether anyone is actually monitoring how awake the nation is becoming. You sit in the waiting room of a doctor's office, flipping through a pamphlet that essentially suggests cocaine as a solution for anything short of a house fire. And even then, someone might try sprinkling it on the flames just to see what happens. The cultural enthusiasm grows. Cocaine finds its way into sodas, candies, and patent medicines sold from travelling wagons. A man with impressive sideburns demonstrates a tonic with the showmanship of a magician. 1 sip, and he stands up straighter, smiles wider, and starts talking at a pace that makes you deeply uncomfortable. The crowd gasps as if witnessing divine intervention rather than a man vibrating gently. But beneath all the sparkle and the printed promises, something uneasy hums. You notice the jittery hands of the overworked clerk, the sharpness in customers' eyes, the way some people return to the apothecary a little too often, their footsteps quick, their requests urgent. Cocaine is becoming less of a novelty and more of a daily requirement, the way modern people need caffeine to remember how sentences work. Slowly, uncomfortably, the American medical community begins to notice patterns. Patients with insomnia that no amount of lavender pillows can fix. People experiencing nervous collapses that look suspiciously like the side effects no one wanted to admit existed. Quietly, physicians start reevaluating their enthusiasm. Maybe, just maybe, adding cocaine to children's cough syrup was not the pinnacle of medical wisdom. And you, watching all of this unfold, can feel history shifting. The leaf that once fueled ancient treks through Andean mountains has now been transformed into a household staple, and soon a household concern. Because in early 20th century America, cocaine wasn't yet illegal. But it was already becoming a problem, trying very hard to disguise itself as a solution. Now you're drifting through the 1910s and 20s, watching lawmakers stare suspiciously at cocaine, as if it personally insulted their mother. Regulations begin tightening, slowly squeezing it out of pharmacies and more aggressively into the underground. You're sitting in the back of a smoky committee room, where a semicircle of stern-faced men flip through papers with the profound concentration of people pretending they understand chemistry. They whisper to one another in dramatic tones, glancing nervously at reports filled with phrases like habit-forming tendencies and unexpected levels of energy in the general public. One lawmaker gestures emphatically to a chart that looks less like science. and more like a toddler's attempt at mountain scenery, but nobody questions it. The era is shifting. The country is shifting. And cocaine, the once beloved ingredient of soothing syrups and fashionable inhalers, is rapidly losing its invitation to respectable society. Outside the committee room, newspapers blare headlines in fonts large enough to double as a subtle threat. Some stories are accurate, most are exaggerated, and a few are flat-out fever dreams written by journalists who seem to think cocaine gives people superpowers. You skim an article describing someone lifting a horse with unnatural vigour and decide that maybe the country should have taken a breath before letting newspapers write policy. Let's talk tone. Fear is in vogue now. It sells papers, fuels debates, and gives the public something to be collectively anxious about besides World War I, inflation, and the fact that their shoes are incredibly uncomfortable. Cocaine, once the shiny new toy of medicine, suddenly becomes the villain of the decade. It didn't change. Public opinion did. As you drift down the street, you notice pharmacies quietly removing cocaine products from their window displays. Apothecaries pretend those tonics never existed, sweeping away incriminating labels like a teenager hiding evidence before their parents get home. The shift isn't loud, it's not dramatic, it's a slow, cautious retreat. Society stepping away from cocaine the way someone steps away from a squirrel acting a little too confident. Meanwhile, the government begins passing laws with names that sound reassuring and slightly paternal, like the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. It doesn't ban cocaine outright, but it taxes and regulates the life out of it, which, in government terms, is the same thing. Physicians grumble, pharmacists roll their eyes, customers are confused, and you watch as cocaine slips from miracle medicine into the murky category of things you now need to whisper about. But criminalization doesn't just push cocaine out of the medicine cabinet, it pushes it underground. You wander into a dimly lit speakeasy, because it's the 1920s and everything fun now happens in places lit, like moody jazz album covers, and notice people doing cocaine discreetly, nervously, as if the walls might tattle. The drug hasn't disappeared. It's just traded doctors' offices for back rooms, trading safe-ish dosing for guesswork and secrecy. And while lawmakers congratulate themselves for saving the nation, you watch the unintended consequences bloom. Crackdowns push suppliers to adapt, innovate, and evade. Users become harder to reach and even harder to treat. The public grows more curious. Prohibition has a way of making forbidden things sparkle. Still, the tightening continues. More regulations, more taxes, more moral speeches delivered with the emotional intensity of someone trying to ban fun itself. And every year, cocaine feels a little more like a ghost, still present, still potent, but no longer welcomed anywhere polite conversation is happening. By the late 1920s, the transformation is complete. Cocaine has become a shadow in American life, slipping through cities like a rumor. Doctors stop prescribing it. Pharmacies stop advertising it. Families pretend those old tonics were something else entirely. The country moves on, congratulating itself on its restraint, right up until alcohol prohibition collapses and the national conversation shifts abruptly to gin. You drift away from the decade with a quiet realization. America didn't stop cocaine, it just buried it. And one day, decades later, it will dig itself out in a form no one, not even those nervous lawmakers, could have predicted. Decades pass. You're floating through the mid-century, where cocaine remains a luxury product enjoyed mostly by the wealthy, like expensive shoes, but more dangerous and significantly less comfortable. You drift into the smoky back room of a post-war cocktail party, the kind where people wear tuxedos so stiff they look like they were pressed between encyclopedia volumes. A jazz trio hums gently in the background. Glasses clink, laughter rolls across the room like soft thunder, and for a moment you think everything seems almost normal. Then someone whose profession you're not entirely sure of, artist, banker, part-time existentialist, leans over a marble coffee table and inhales an extremely confident-looking line of cocaine. He immediately begins describing how he's never felt more alive, despite simultaneously sweating through his suit jacket. Welcome to cocaine's quiet era. Not gone, not forgotten, just hiding behind velvet curtains and expensive furniture. You wander from gathering to gathering, watching as the drug worms its way into elite social circles, not loudly, not dangerously yet, but with the hushed exclusivity of a secret menu item you only know about if you know a guy who knows a guy. For the wealthy, cocaine isn't a crisis, it's an accessory, a conversation piece, a way to feel glamorous while pretending their marriages are going fine. Let's talk accessibility. Cocaine in the mid-20th century is pricey, so pricey in fact that only people who also buy imported cheeses without looking at the price tags can afford it. It's smuggled in small quantities, tucked into briefcases, passed hand to hand between businessmen who insist they're not really into it, while gently straightening their ties for the third time in 8 minutes. You spot it in Hollywood too, floating through movie sets and after-parties where actors whisper about creative enhancement, while ignoring the fact that their pupils have become dinner plates. But despite the glamorous facade, there's something eerie about this quiet phase. You notice it in the way people treat cocaine like a toy that doesn't have sharp edges yet. The medical community, now thoroughly embarrassed by its past enthusiasm, mostly pretends cocaine doesn't exist. Policymakers don't feel the need to panic. The public barely knows what it is anymore. It's like an old celebrity who still shows up at parties even though everyone forgot why they were famous. You float into the 1950s, where suburban families are discovering television, Tupperware, and the joy of not thinking about global problems for a while. Cocaine, meanwhile, is tucked away in urban nightlife and international trade routes. Quiet, patient, waiting. In the 1960s, as counterculture explodes, cocaine hovers around the edges. Hippies choose psychedelics, protesters prefer marijuana. Cocaine stays with the upper crust, sipping expensive liquor and waiting its turn like a well-mannered disaster. And then there's the scent of globalization creeping in. You overhear conversations in dim bars and shipping warehouses, new suppliers in South America, new trafficking routes, new possibilities. Cocaine is still rare, still elite, but the system that will one day deliver it to the masses is quietly forming under everyone's nose. You can almost feel the tension in the air, like the low hum before a storm rolls over the horizon. As the 1970s approach, you float into glittering discotheques where cocaine finally starts peeking out into broader circles. It's still expensive, still glamorous, but suddenly more available than it should be. You watch dancers in sequins and polyester inhale tiny white lines before spinning back under neon lights, feeling invincible, euphoric, and definitely not aware that this chapter of cocaine's story is about to take a very dark turn. Because that's the thing about the silent years. They're rarely truly silent. They're build-up, pressure. The inhale before history exhales something nobody is prepared for. And as you drift out of the mid-century, one realization settles around you like cigarette smoke in a crowded lounge. Cocaine hasn't disappeared. It's simply been waiting for the perfect moment to explode into the mainstream, and that moment is coming. Welcome to the 1970s, where the disco balls spin, the collars are wide, and cocaine has re-entered society through the VIP entrance. You watch as it becomes glamorous, normalized, and utterly misunderstood. You step into a nightclub where everything is glowing. People, pants, drinks, even the wallpaper seems to be radiating confidence. The bass thumps through your body like a second heartbeat, and every surface is either sequined, mirrored, or both. You wander under the neon lights, noticing that nearly everyone looks just a little too awake. Eyes wide, voices loud, energy levels approaching. I just drank 6 espressos and told the barista my life story. Cocaine, once tucked away in the pockets of wealthy eccentrics, has become the unofficial lubricant of the decade. It slides across glass tables in thin, careful lines, always accompanied by someone saying, "It's harmless, everybody's doing it." You watch celebrities, stockbrokers, aspiring actors, and people whose job titles you cannot confidently identify take hits with the kind of enthusiasm normally reserved for tax refunds and unexpected days off. The 1970s didn't invent the idea of feeling invincible, but cocaine certainly gave it a promotional boost. Let's talk fashion. This is the era of tight shirts, flared pants, and hair so voluminous it could block sunlight. People strut across dance floors as if auditioning for a movie that hasn't been written yet. Cocaine blends into this world perfectly, a designer drug for an era addicted to being fabulous. You watch someone lean over a tabletop and exhale triumphantly afterward, as if they've just solved world peace instead of briefly enhancing their heart rate. The dealers of this era? Oh, they are characters. Some look like failed magicians, others like accountants who took a wrong turn in life, but all of them operate with the unshakable confidence of people who believe they are providing a public service. They slip packets into hands at parties, concerts, hotel lobbies, anywhere someone might say, "Man, I wish this night felt more electric." Cocaine is expensive, but the kind of expensive people brag about. A status symbol, a glittering badge of "I hang out with the right people." Meanwhile, you notice something unsettling beneath the glamour. The euphoric energy has a jittery undertone, like everyone is operating 3 seconds ahead of their own thoughts. You watch conversations spiral from flirty to philosophical to chaotic in the span of a single song. Some people dance with transcendent confidence. Others talk rapidly about business ideas that absolutely should not be pursued. Cocaine is turning the entire decade into a fast-forward button. And here's the thing, almost no one sees the danger coming. Cocaine is marketed, whispered, and mythologized as a non-addictive upper, a harmless helper, a productivity hack before productivity hacks were cool. Doctors warn quietly, newspapers publish cautious articles, but in rooms filled with flashing lights and relentless music, nobody is listening. Why would they? Everyone looks fantastic and feels unstoppable. That's the whole problem. You wander outside the club into the humid summer air. The street is alive, taxis honking, people shouting greetings from block to block, the city vibrating like it drank from the same stash as its citizens. Cocaine is no longer confined to nightlife. It's weaving through businesses, art studios, recording sessions, and office buildings. A musician scribbles lyrics at 4 a.m., convinced this is the masterpiece that will define an era. A broker signs a deal he'll regret by sunrise. An entire generation is flying high on a stimulant no one bothered to fully research, and somewhere far to the south, in jungles and small villages, coca cultivation is expanding. Suppliers are watching demand spike, their eyes widening in the exact same way as the nightclub patrons. Money is flowing, networks are forming. The groundwork is quietly, inevitably being laid. Because the 1970s isn't just a decade of glitter and good vibes, it's the decade before the storm. And as you drift away from the dance floor, you can sense it. A shift, a pressure, the tightening of a narrative you've seen before. Cocaine is about to get cheaper, stronger, and far more destructive. The party won't last forever. It never does. Somewhere in a kitchen or makeshift lab, someone experiments with heat, cocaine, and baking soda. Congratulations, you're witnessing the birth of crack cocaine, a substance cheap enough to spread fast and potent enough to wreck everything in its path. You stand in the corner of a dim apartment kitchen, one of those small, echoing spaces where the floor creaks, the windows don't open properly, and the wallpaper is doing its best to peel itself off the walls out of self-respect. A pot bubbles on the stove, releasing a smell that is neither culinary nor comforting. Someone carefully measures out baking soda, dumps it into the mixture, and stirs with a seriousness normally reserved for baking holiday cookies, not creating a drug that will reshape an entire era. It doesn't look like history being made. It looks like someone making very bad soup. But then the mixture reacts, fizzing, clumping, transforming into small, solid rocks. You watch as they cool on a tray like sinister little cookies that could ruin an entire nation's sleep schedule. The room fills with a quiet tension, and then, as if the world is holding its breath, someone takes the first puff. The effect is immediate, fast, fierce, overwhelming, cheaper than powder cocaine, easier to distribute, faster to hit, faster to hook. You're watching the chemical equivalent of a tectonic shift. Let's talk chemistry, very gently, because nobody here is in a headspace for a textbook. Powder cocaine dissolves in water. Crack cocaine doesn't. That difference, born from the oddly innocent presence of baking soda, turns an elite party drug into something that can be smoked quickly, absorbed instantly, and sold cheaply. It bypasses the slow drip of snorting and goes straight for the I need another hit right now region of the brain. If powder cocaine was a business class upgrade, crack is a roller coaster ride where the safety bar definitely does not lock. You drift through the apartment as the mixture is made again and again. The ingredients are simple, too simple. This accessibility is the birth of the problem. You can sense it in the air, the feeling that someone has accidentally invented a disaster. Not on purpose, not with malice, just as an experiment. Like microwaving tinfoil, but much, much worse. Step outside that apartment and into the wider world. You walk through neighborhoods already stretched thin by unemployment, underfunded schools, and a sense of exhaustion woven into daily life. You see young men on stoops, kids playing near fire hydrants, families navigating rising rents and shrinking opportunities. When crack arrives, it hits these communities like a spark landing on a field of dry grass. Its low price gives it velocity, its potency gives it claws. Dealers quickly grasp the appeal, small rocks, sold cheaply, high return. Users grasp it even faster. The hit comes like lightning, fast, hot, euphoric, vanishing almost as quickly as it arrives. And the hunger to feel that lightning again grows with frightening speed. You drift into living rooms where people once gathered to watch sitcoms and now stare at the floor, jittering with nervous energy. You walk down streets where laughter becomes rare and tension grows like mold in damp corners. Crack doesn't just disrupt a few households, it rearranges entire neighborhoods, block by block, life by life. Soon, abandoned buildings become unofficial markets. Police radios crackle more often, hospitals brace, schools shift, journalists sharpen pencils, politicians raise eyebrows, and high above all of this, in penthouse apartments far from the storm, powder cocaine still flows freely among the wealthy, untouched, unblamed, unassociated with the chaos forming below. That's the cruel irony. Same plant, same origin, same chemical family. But once someone heated it with baking soda in a kitchen, just like the one you were standing in, the story split. One path stayed glamorous, the other became catastrophe. As you step away from the stove, the tray of cooling rock sits in front of you, quiet, unassuming, almost boring. But you know better. This is the moment the storm begins, the moment chemistry accidentally opened a door society was wildly unprepared to walk through, A handful of rocks, a kitchen, a pot on a stove, and the world quietly, irreversibly changed. You look around at a perfectly innocent pantry product and wonder how on earth it became part of an epidemic. The answer? Chemistry, desperation, and a recipe so easy, even someone half asleep might accidentally innovate disaster. It's unsettling, really. You open a cupboard expecting the usual suspects: flour, sugar, that one spice you bought 8 years ago and have used exactly once, and instead you realise you're staring at one of the unlikeliest accomplices in criminal history. Baking soda, the mild-mannered household helper that whitens teeth, deodorises fridges, and apparently moonlights as a key ingredient in social collapse. You can almost hear it whisper, "I was just here to make cookies. How did things go so wrong?" To understand baking soda's unexpected career pivot, you drift into an imaginary chemistry class taught by a man who definitely doesn't get paid enough. He scribbles on the chalkboard about acids and bases with enthusiastic sweeps, explaining how sodium bicarbonate reacts under heat. You nod politely, pretending to follow along, even though half your brain is thinking, okay, but how does this connect to an entire generation losing sleep and stability? Then the teacher casually mentions that, with cocaine hydrochloride and the right technique, baking soda helps form smokable crystals, and suddenly everything clicks in the worst possible way. The simplicity is the terrifying part. Crack cocaine isn't the product of sophisticated laboratory setups or expensive equipment. It's the product of kitchens, stovetops, and materials so ordinary they're probably sitting right behind your oatmeal. The recipe, if we can even use such a wholesome word for something so catastrophic, requires only cocaine powder, baking soda, water, heat, and a willingness to ignore every warning sign the universe sends your way. You drift into one of those same tiny apartments, where the air is thick with steam and tension. Someone measures out baking soda the way a distracted grandmother might measure ingredients for a pie, by feel, by guess, by instinct. It's improvised chemistry, guided by trial, error, and the desperate hope that the final product will sell. And the moment the mixture solidifies into small hard chunks, baking soda officially becomes an accomplice. Let's talk motivation. Most people weren't turning to chemistry because they wanted to innovate. They turned to it because cocaine powder was expensive, life was unforgiving, and opportunity was scarce. Baking soda helped stretch the product, making it cheaper, more accessible, and dramatically more addictive. It was the perfect storm of economics and chemistry. A simple household powder lowering the barrier to entry for a drug that already had a reputation for making people feel like the most confident versions of themselves for about 10 minutes. As you walk through neighborhoods on the brink of the crisis, you see how easily desperation meets innovation. Unemployment is rising. Housing conditions are deteriorating. The social safety net looks more like a piece of string holding up a refrigerator door. When crack arrives, a cheap, potent, instantly euphoric, it spreads faster than anyone can comprehend, and right behind it, like a loyal but misguided companion, sits baking soda, silently fueling the supply chain. You peer once more into that innocent white box, the one covered in cheerful orange branding and helpful baking tips. It still smells faintly like childhood memories and half-successful cookie experiments. But now you know the full story. Baking soda didn't mean to become a villain. It just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong chemical compatibility. And that's what makes this part of history so jarring. Crack cocaine wasn't born in gleaming laboratories or masterminded by genius chemists. It emerged from kitchens, from cupboards, from ingredients sitting next to pancake mix. The supervillain wasn't the baking soda, just the circumstances that allowed it to be weaponized. Still, as you slide the box back onto the pantry shelf in your mind's eye, you can't help feeling a little uneasy. Because the history of crack teaches you something deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes the most devastating things begin with tools we were sure were harmless. You drift into the 1980s, a decade where crack spreads not because of magic, but because it is cheap, fast, powerful, and devastatingly profitable. You watch entire neighborhoods sink under the weight of a supply and demand curve nobody asked for. You land on a street corner where things are humming, too fast, too intensely, like someone turned the city's speed dial from leisurely stroll to we have somewhere to be immediately. Dealers move quickly, scanning for opportunity and danger in equal measure. Users come and go like nervous shadows, handing over crumpled bills for tiny rocks that offer a euphoric 10-minute escape from everything weighing them down. You watch the rhythm unfold, the exchange, the retreat, the inevitable return. It's a loop powered by chemistry and desperation, economics and exhaustion. And here's the brutal truth. Crack didn't explode because of some mystical inevitability. It exploded because the math made sense. Horrifying, tragic sense. Powder cocaine was expensive, a luxury product reserved for people who could drop the equivalent of a car payment on a weekend habit. But crack democratized access to a drug that hit harder, faster and cheaper than anything else on the market. You could buy a high for the price of a fast food meal. The barrier to entry fell through the floor. You watch a dealer break down a single ounce of cocaine into dozens, sometimes hundreds, of $5 and $10 rocks. The profit margins are absurd. If economists had been paying attention, they would have fainted. The street corner becomes an assembly line, each sale reinforcing the logic that this new product is too lucrative to resist and too addictive to slow down. For communities crushed by unemployment and systemic neglect, crack dealing becomes one of the few industries hiring. You walk past teenagers barely old enough to drive, running transactions with the seriousness of seasoned entrepreneurs. The stakes are life and death, but the pay, compared to minimum wage, is impossible to ignore. Let's talk supply. South American cartels, already flush from the powder cocaine boom of the 70s, discover that crack rockets their profits into the stratosphere. The product moves faster, costs drop, demand skyrockets, smuggling routes expand like overgrown vines reaching toward every major city in the United States. You drift above shipping containers, private planes, and border crossings humming with activity. It's a well-oiled global machine, one that no government agency is prepared to interrupt effectively. Back in the neighborhoods, crack's economic warfare takes a toll. The drug is cheap enough for constant use, which means people get hooked faster than they can climb out. Each high lasts minutes, not hours, driving demand to an unsustainable pace. Families crumble under the pressure. Paychecks vanish. Apartment buildings hollow out as businesses close, people move, or violence pushes them away. You see corner stores installing metal grates, schools scrambling for resources, and parents locking their doors by sunset. Even law enforcement can't keep up. You watch police cars circling blocks like confused guard dogs, unsure where to start. Arrests happen, lots of them, but they don't make a dent. For every dealer arrested, two more step into the role, attracted by the same irresistible financial incentive. For every user jailed, another takes their place, pulled in by the momentary relief crack promises, and as always, the inequalities woven into society become painfully clear. Affluent communities abusing powder cocaine are largely shielded from consequence. They receive rehabilitation, sympathy, privacy. Poor communities grappling with crack-face surveillance, arrests, and policies written with panic instead of precision. The economics of the crisis are not just financial, they're structural, racial, and political. And you, drifting through it all, feel the weight of a system spinning out of control. A system built not in laboratories or legislative halls, but in the invisible forces of scarcity and opportunity, desperation and profit. Crack wasn't unstoppable because it was chemically clever. It was unstoppable because it made too much money for too many people on every rung of the ladder. Economics didn't just fuel the epidemic, they locked it into place. Suddenly you're surrounded by dramatic news anchors describing crack as if it were a comic book villain wearing a trench coat. Fear sells, and you can feel the nation's heart rate spike in real time. You're standing in a 1980s living room where the television is the size of a small refrigerator and weighs as much as a medium-sized cow. Every channel is broadcasting the same breathless urgency. Aerial shots of police raids, shaky footage of street corners, and anchors who lean so far forward they look like they're about to fall into the lens. They speak in hushed yet theatrical tones, letting words like epidemic, war zone, and unstoppable threat hang dramatically in the air. You half expect them to start whispering ominous Latin phrases. The music swells, graphics flash, news stations unveil special segments titled things like Crackdown America, Streets of Danger, and the very subtle nightmare in our neighbourhoods. It's less journalism and more opening credits to a disaster film. You stare at the screen, noticing how none of the reporters blink, not once. Their eyes are wide, urgent, shimmering with the promise of ratings. Let's talk incentives. Television news in the 1980s is elbowing its way into a more competitive, more sensational era. And the crack epidemic, a chaotic, frightening, poorly understood crisis, becomes the perfect storyline, simple, dramatic, visually gripping. The media doesn't just report the crisis, it frames it, shapes it, and amplifies it until the entire country is sitting 3 inches from their screens, clutching their armrests, wondering whether crack is hiding in their pantry next to the raisins. You drift into a newsroom where producers huddle around a long table, piled with storyboards and half-eaten bagels. They circle buzzwords on notepads like generals mapping out a battlefield. Dramatic, one says. Urgent, says another. Scary but digestible, adds a third, biting into a stale sesame bagel with the same seriousness he gives to editorial decisions. There's little time for nuance. There's no time for context. The goal is simple. Keep viewers watching. You shift into another home on another street. Different family. Same broadcast. A mother holds her breath as news clips roll of police in tactical gear kicking down doors. A father turns up the volume, hearing about crack as though it were a supernatural force sweeping through the nation. The kids sit cross-legged on the carpet, absorbing the message that their world is more dangerous than they ever imagined. Meanwhile, the places being reported on begin to feel the pressure. Neighbourhoods struggling with poverty, underfunded schools and decades of neglect now have giant cameras pointed at them, zooming in on their darkest moments. A single street becomes shorthand for an entire community. Entire cities become symbols of chaos. Reporters parachute in for sound bites, carefully avoiding any stories that don't involve flashing sirens, shattered glass, or someone yelling in the background. And the metaphors. Oh, the metaphors. Crack is described as an invading army, a plague, a monster. You hear one anchor describe a baggie of rocks with the same trembling reverence one might use to discuss an ancient curse. The dramatization becomes self-sustaining. Fear leads to viewership. Viewership leads to more fear. Soon, even those who never see crack firsthand feel surrounded by it. But something else happens too. Something quieter, more insidious. The media's framing begins shaping policy. Politicians tune in. Committees form. Funding shifts. The images of crack houses and street corners become justification for sweeping laws, harsher sentencing, and increased policing. You can practically see the legislative wheels turning as senators watch their nightly news, clutching coffee cups like medieval talismans. And through all this, nuance evaporates. Nobody talks about unemployment. Nobody talks about redlining, disinvestment, housing collapse, inadequate healthcare, or the broader structures that allowed crack to flourish. It's simpler, more satisfying to say, this drug is evil, and we must defeat it. The complexity dissolves like sugar dropped into hot tea. As you drift back from the television glow, you realize the media didn't invent the crisis, but it did choreograph it. It turned tragedy into programming, suffering into segments, and fear into a narrative arc. In the 1980s, crack didn't just make the news, it became the news, and the whole country stayed tuned. You find yourself inside the halls of government where people are shouting war on drugs with the enthusiasm of someone who hasn't yet read the instructions on how to wage one. Paperwork flies, assistants sprint, senators lean dramatically over conference tables, declaring bold strategies based on vibes, headlines, and the faint hope that saying war loudly enough will fix the problem. You sit quietly in the back, watching elected officials approach drug policy the way someone might try assembling IKEA furniture without the manual, confident, determined, and absolutely wrong. The room buzzes with panic, not productive panic. More like the we don't know what's happening, but we feel pressured to look decisive brand of panic. One lawmaker suggests harsher penalties, another wants more police funding, a third announces proudly that he has never touched a drug in his life and therefore feels uniquely qualified to give advice. You rub your temples. Everyone nods as if these statements are helpful. Let's talk about the setup. Crack is spreading rapidly, and the federal government is desperate to look like it's doing something, anything, besides shrugging helplessly. So they announce a war. Not a metaphorical war. A full-on rhetorical one with slogans, press conferences, and the swagger of a nation that still thinks it can solve complex crises with catchy phrases. But there's no army to mobilize. There's no battlefield to storm. Just communities buckling under the weight of social problems that began decades before the first rock ever formed in a saucepan. You drift through hearings where charts and graphs are waved around like talismans. None of them agree. Some look upside down. One appears to be labelled in crayon. A senator slams a fist on the table and insists we must get tough. As if toughness alone will magically produce treatment facilities, economic support, or access to quality healthcare. Another calls for mandatory minimums with the kind of theatrical passion usually reserved for sports rivalries. No one mentions root causes. No one utters words like poverty, housing, jobs, or mental health. It's far easier, politically safer, to blame a substance than to confront the systems that allowed it to wreak havoc. As laws pass with alarming speed, you float out of the Capitol building and into communities where these policies land like falling bricks. More police, more arrests, younger defendants, longer sentences. A single mistake, a single rock, becomes enough to derail entire futures. You watch judges, bound by new sentencing rules, reluctantly hand out punishments that feel out of proportion to the crime. You see overcrowded jails ballooning, public defenders drowning, families unravelling. Meanwhile, the supply of crack does not shrink, not even a little. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot arrest your way out of an economic crisis. You cannot imprison your way out of addiction. You cannot declare war on a substance and expect it to surrender. But policymakers, flooded with fear-driven headlines and frantic constituents, double down anyway. You drift into DEA offices where agents wear expressions somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. They raid houses, seize drugs, arrest dealers, and the next day, the market fills back in like a pothole patched with whipped cream. They know this cycle, they live inside it. They can't say it out loud, but you can see it in their posture. The war is unwinnable because the enemy isn't just crack. It's everything that made crack appealing in the first place. And then there's the political theatre. Press conferences where leaders vow victory with the confidence of people who won't personally pay the cost. TV ads show dramatic reenactments of drug deals. Presidential speeches warn of crack fiends lurking behind every corner. Fear becomes policy. Image becomes strategy. Ambiguity becomes certainty. And in all of this noise, one thing becomes painfully clear. The government is fighting symptoms, not disease. Declaring war on crack is easier than confronting decades of underfunding, redlining, job loss, failing schools and collapsing infrastructure. It's easier than admitting they don't have a master plan, just a megaphone. As you float back out of the government halls, the echo of war on drugs grows distant. You feel the hollowness behind it, not malicious, just misguided. A war was declared. But nobody brought a blueprint, and nobody asked whether the people most affected wanted a battlefield in the first place. Welcome to the justice system, where powder cocaine leads to a courtroom and crack cocaine leads to an entire novel of prison time. You, in the jury box, can practically hear the sound of fairness packing its bags. You sit in the polished wooden courtroom, a place that smells faintly like old books, cold coffee, and the lingering disappointment of countless verdicts. The judge enters wearing robes that give off stern wizard energy. Prosecutors shuffle papers. Defense attorneys brace themselves. And you, watching quietly, begin to pick up on the unspoken hierarchy. Not all cocaine is treated equally, at least not here. On the table in front of you lie two nearly identical substances. Powder cocaine sits in a neat little bag, practically posing for a headshot. Crack cocaine sits beside it, in small rock-like chunks that look exactly like something a stressed-out geologist would misplace. Chemically, they're almost the same. Legally, they're galaxies apart. Let's talk about the infamous 100-to-1 sentencing rule, the legislative plot twist nobody asked for. Passed in the mid-1980s, it declares that possessing 1 gram of crack cocaine is treated the same as possessing 100 grams of powder cocaine. You blink. You look at the substances again. 100-to-1. Your brain quietly does the math. The punishment for a handful of crack rocks equals the punishment for a small mountain of powder. Somewhere in the distance, you imagine a scale of justice tipping so hard it does a full somersault. Mandatory minimums make the situation even harder to swallow. Judges no longer have discretion. Not really. Say a defendant is caught with a few grams of crack. The judge, who might privately think the sentence is excessive, is bound by law to hand out years, sometimes decades, behind bars. You can almost see the regret behind their eyes. They lower the gavel anyway. Thud. The room goes still. Meanwhile, cases involving powder cocaine, more commonly found in wealthier, whiter communities, tend to glide through the system with far gentler consequences. A slap on the wrist, probation, access to treatment options, a sympathetic headline about promising futures. Powder cocaine is treated not like a crime but like an inconvenience. You drift into the hallways where public defenders lean heavily against beige walls, clutching files stacked so high they could double as furniture. They sigh, exhausted. They know what's coming before they even step inside the courtroom. They've watched mandatory minimums swallow generation after generation with mathematical coldness. Their clients often come from neighbourhoods already strained by unemployment, underfunded schools and heavy policing. Crack didn't cause those problems, it just collided with them in the worst possible way. The sentencing disparity hits these communities like a wrecking ball. Families fracture when one parent is sent away for a decade-long sentence that would have been months, or avoided entirely if the drug had been in powder form instead. Children grow up visiting parents behind glass. Whole blocks experience the slow, hollowing out effect as more and more people disappear into the prison system. You walk past houses with curtains drawn, front steps empty, laughter replaced by absence. Politicians reassure the public that these laws are necessary for safety. They talk about deterrence, they talk about crime reduction. They do not talk about the decades of structural inequality that funneled crack into certain communities and powder into others. They do not talk about how punishment without support simply creates a revolving door of misery. But in the shadows of the courthouse, activists begin to rise. Public defenders, scholars, mothers, pastors, people who see the numbers for what they are. Not protection, but punishment layered unevenly across racial and economic lines. They start pushing for reform. They speak at city meetings, organise teach-ins, fight cases, write reports. It will take decades for the government to admit the disparity was wrong. It will take even longer to fix it. Back inside the courtroom, a new defendant is called forward. You watch them stand before the judge, shoulders slumped, hands trembling. Their entire future hinges on grams, numbers, and a law written during a moral panic. The gavel rises. Fairness is nowhere to be found. And you feel with chilling clarity that this isn't justice. It's arithmetic, and the equation was rigged. You step into abandoned buildings, dimly lit corners, and entire blocks transformed by the fast-moving economics of addiction. Everything feels hollowed out, as if the walls themselves are tired. The air in these buildings hangs heavy, not just with smoke, but with a sense of collapse. You walk over floorboards that creak like they're begging for retirement. Wallpaper peels in long, curling strips, the kind that look like they're trying to escape the room entirely. The windows are broken or boarded, letting in only thin, reluctant rays of light. This isn't a home anymore. It's a symptom with an address. In the corner, a group huddles close together, speaking in hurried whispers. A dealer sits like a grim shopkeeper behind a makeshift counter, usually a flipped milk crate or a piece of plywood balanced on cinder blocks. Transactions happen quickly, quietly, with the urgency of people trying not to think about what they're doing. You feel the tension in the air like every second is hanging by a thread. You step back outside, and the neighbourhood tells the same story in wider strokes. Once thriving blocks now sit half empty. Buildings lean in strange directions as if the foundations are giving up. Bright murals are faded. Playgrounds rust quietly, and local businesses that once sold sandwiches and hardware now sell lottery tickets and existential dread. The whole landscape seems to be exhaling, slowly, painfully. Let's talk architecture, in the loosest sense of the word. Crack houses aren't built, they're claimed. Any structure can transform into one: an abandoned apartment, a foreclosed home, a forgotten office space. The requirements are simple: walls, a roof, and a door that closes just enough to imply privacy. The rest of the environment adapts around it like a neighbourhood reluctantly accommodating a new, unwelcome tenant. The police know these buildings well. So do neighbours whose nights are punctuated by sirens and shouted arguments. You watch patrol cars cruise by slowly, their headlights slicing through shadows. Officers approach crack houses with caution, aware that every entry is unpredictable. They knock hard. They announce themselves. They enter with uniforms, tents, and flashlights raised, ready to break the loop for a minute or an hour, but never permanently. Inside, the scenes repeat. Mattresses on floors, cooking utensils being used for chemistry instead of dinner, pipes and lighters scattered across tables like the remnants of a chaotic science project. You notice the absence of things as much as the presence of them. There are no family photos, no bookshelves, no plants in the window, nothing that suggests someone is living here, only surviving here. But the architecture of the crisis extends far beyond the buildings themselves. It shapes the social landscape. You see grandparents stepping up as primary caregivers as parents disappear into addiction or imprisonment. You see children learning to navigate chaos with an attentiveness that feels far too old for them. Schools struggle, community centres close, entire neighbourhoods absorb wound after wound until hope feels like a rumour. Still, you catch glimpses of resilience, a neighbour sweeping their stoop every morning, even though the street sweeps back chaos every night. A local pastor organising meal deliveries, a mother walking her child to school with determination that looks like defiance. These small acts push back against the decay for one more day. Yet the scale remains overwhelming. Crack houses become hubs in a destructive economy, places where addiction accelerates and danger concentrates. They draw crime, they repel investment, they deepen the divides between those who can leave and those who cannot. Even buildings that aren't crack houses begin to feel haunted by association. You run your hand along a brick wall and feel the exhaustion baked into it. And then, slowly, the term crack house stops referring to just a building. It becomes shorthand for decline, for despair, for everything policymakers ignored until the crisis forced itself onto their desks in headlines and heat maps. The architecture becomes symbolic, a warning, a plea, a problem people want solved but rarely want to understand. You step back, looking at the warped skyline of a neighbourhood reshaped by a drug that arrived too quickly, hit too hard and stayed too long. The buildings stand, technically, but they don't feel like they're standing. They feel like they're holding their breath. Here, you feel the emotional gravity, children navigating chaos, parents disappearing into addiction, and communities buckling under pressure they did not create. You stand in the doorway of a small apartment where the lights flicker, not dramatically, but with the defeated rhythm of someone who has given up trying to fix them. A child sits on the floor with toys that used to belong to someone else, an older sibling who now comes home only unpredictably, or not at all. You watch her stack the blocks quietly, carefully, the way children do when they have already learned that loud noises sometimes make adults angry. The silence feels heavy, thick, as if the air itself remembers better years. Then you drift into a kitchen where a grandmother stirs a pot of soup. She moves slowly, shoulders stooped, not from age, but from carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be hers. She's raising 3 grandchildren now. Their parents are around, though around could mean anything. A rehab facility, a distant relative's house, a street corner, a cell. She ladles bowls onto the table with the gentle determination of someone who refuses to give in to hopelessness. But you can see it in her eyes. Exhaustion that goes bone deep. You step outside into a neighbourhood where front porches creak beneath the weight of conversations nobody wants to have. Parents sit with coffee that's gone cold, looking out at streets that shift between quiet and chaotic within the same afternoon. They speak in low voices about missing work, about what they can afford, about where their teenage sons are right now, and whether they should be worried. Let's talk about the children. They are the ones who absorb impact with no protective gear. You see them walking to school past crack houses they know to avoid. You watch them rehearse excuses for teachers. My mum is sick. My dad is working late. I stayed at my cousin's house. They become experts at navigating adult problems long before they finish multiplication tables. Some become caretakers. Some become ghosts in their own lives. Some grow fiercely resilient, but resilience is not a gift, it's a burden. And the parents caught in addiction? You see them too, not caricatures, humans. Many living with pain long before crack ever existed, unemployment, trauma, poor healthcare, generational poverty. They don't wake up wanting to disappear. They lose ground slowly, painfully, slipping down a slope nobody warned them was this steep. You watch a mother sitting alone in a dim living room, staring at the wall, wishing for a way back to who she used to be. You watch a father in a clinic waiting room, hands shaking, not from withdrawal, but from shame. These are not monsters. These are people whose lives collided with a drug engineered to offer escape at a price no one can afford. And then there are the echoes, the ones that linger long after the crisis arrives. A birthday missed, a school play with an empty seat, a kid learning to braid her own hair because no one else is steady enough to do it, a family photo where the smiles look practiced. You don't need to search for metaphors. The loss hangs in the air like dust. But communities don't collapse without fighting back. You drift into church basements where volunteers pack food boxes with quiet urgency. You see neighbours checking in on one another, making sure someone's watching the kids, someone's cooking dinner, someone's calling the shelters. You watch block associations form, not out of enthusiasm, but out of necessity, and somehow that necessity creates a kind of strength. Still, the toll remains visible. Schools strain under the weight of needs they were never funded for. Counsellors juggle caseloads that should belong to entire teams. Teachers learn to spot trauma the way others learn to read body language. The echoes of the epidemic aren't just emotional, they're structural, woven into every system that cracks under pressure. As you drift from one home to another, you feel it. The heaviness of a decade where families tried to hold themselves together while the world around them pulled apart. The crisis was chemical, yes, but the damage was deeply human. And many of those echoes never fully fade. Some just learn to speak softer. You watch as policymakers and media invent a label so inaccurate and harmful that future historians will cringe every time they read it. You're standing in a mid-1990s conference room where a handful of officials huddle around a long table, strewn with crime reports, coffee-stained folders, and half-eaten pastries. Someone clears their throat dramatically, slides a glossy chart across the table, and proclaims with academic confidence, "We are dealing with super predators." The room murmurs, heads nod. No one asks follow-up questions such as, what does that actually mean? Or should we maybe take a deep breath before redefining an entire generation? Instead, pens begin scribbling as though the term arrived on stone tablets. You drift closer to the chart. It's a mess of rising lines, bold fonts, and ominous arrows pointing upward, giving the impression that crime is about to physically leap off the paper and chase the reader. Never mind the missing context, the incomplete data, or the fact that most actual criminologists were busy yelling, "This is not how statistics work," into the void. The myth has momentum now, and momentum is dangerous. The term super predator, coined to describe supposedly remorseless, violent youth, spreads through political speeches faster than anyone can fact-check it. You watch lawmakers deliver it with the gravity of a Shakespearean monologue. Their voices tremble, their brows furrow. They warn that a new wave of ultra-violent teens is about to sweep the nation. You look around and notice the teens in question. A group of kids waiting for the bus, wearing oversized jackets, cracking jokes about who forgot their homework again. Monsters? No, just cold. But nuance has left the building. Fear marches on. Next, you drift into a newsroom where producers scramble to package this myth into digestible terror. They slap the word super predator onto bold red graphics. They splice together clips of unrelated crimes, edit footage to look more dramatic, and narrate in tones usually reserved for haunted house tours. Soon, Americans are sitting at home, clutching remote controls, convinced that children in baggy jeans are somehow plotting the downfall of civilization. The story spreads like wildfire because it's simple, it's sensational, it gives viewers someone to blame, and best of all for ratings, it doesn't require anyone to confront the uncomfortable truth that the rise in youth crime was actually small, temporary and deeply linked to structural issues like poverty, disinvestment, failing schools, and the proliferation of guns. Why examine decades of policy failure when you can wag a finger at teenagers? Meanwhile, you walk through the communities being affected, and the myth looms everywhere like a shadow that never asked permission to exist. Teachers start looking at their students differently. Police patrol more aggressively. Curfews tighten, neighbours whisper. A generation of kids, mostly black and brown youth, carry a label that implies they are inherently dangerous, irredeemable, and destined for violence. The harm is not metaphorical, it is structural, measurable, and immediate. You sit in a courtroom and watch a 14-year-old boy be tried as an adult. The judge cites public safety. The prosecutor references the new breed of criminals. The boy stares at his shoes. You can feel the myth at work, heavy, invisible, powerful. Behind you, the seats creak under the weight of families holding back tears. Justice becomes distorted by a rumour wearing a lab coat. Then, years later, the truth begins to surface. Crime drops dramatically. Researchers debunk the myth. The scholar who coined the term publicly apologises. Historians groan. Journalists re-evaluate. But for the kids the myth targeted, some now adults, some still in prison, sorry doesn't rewind anything. The label did its damage. It shaped policies, hardened sentences, and amplified fear in ways that took decades to unwind. You drift back from the scene with a quiet, heavy realization. Sometimes the most dangerous stories aren't the ones told by criminals, they're the ones told about them. Because a myth, especially one rooted in fear and repeated with confidence, can reshape a nation. And this one did. You drift along patrol cars and federal offices, hearing radios beep and plans collapse. Enforcement becomes a frantic guessing game with no cheat codes. You hover beside a squad car as two officers sit inside sipping terrible gas station coffee and staring at a map dotted with so many pushpins it looks like a porcupine with anxiety. They talk in circles about hotspots, raids, intel and informants, who occasionally vanish like ghosts with unpaid phone bills. Dispatch crackles through the radio with updates that contradict the last 5 updates. The officers sigh in unison, long, weary exhales that suggest even they know they're outnumbered, outpaced, and occasionally outsmarted by teenagers with walkie-talkies. Now you drift into a DEA field office, where agents sit around a conference table littered with empty soda cans, paperwork, and a single motivational poster peeling off the wall. A supervisor points at a flowchart meant to track cartel supply routes. It looks like a plate of spaghetti experiencing an identity crisis. Lines go in every direction. Arrows loop back on themselves. One section is circled with the words "still not sure" written next to it. Agents nod anyway. It's all they can do. And here's the uncomfortable thing. It's not that law enforcement isn't trying. They are trying with intensity, effort, and a level of caffeine consumption that would floor a healthy adult. But crack moves differently, faster, smaller quantities, more potent effects, shorter cycles, more dealers, more users. You can shut down a crack house at 10 a.m. and watch a new one open before lunch. One arrest creates 3 replacements. It's like trying to plug holes in a sinking boat using confetti. You drift along sidewalks at dusk as officers patrol in pairs. They shine flashlights into alleyways, tap boots against loose debris, and keep mental scorecards of who they've seen and who's missing. A dealer spots them and melts into the shadows, slipping through a back door that wasn't visible 2 seconds ago. Someone on a rooftop whistles a warning. Radios light up again. The officers share a look, not fear, not defeat, just the resigned acknowledgement that this game is unwinnable in its current form. Back at the DEA office, agents argue over strategy. Should they go after street dealers, mid-level distributors, cartel importers? Everyone has an opinion. None of the opinions agree. Someone slams a file shut. Someone else rubs their temples. Someone whispers, "We need more people," as if hiring 40 more agents will single-handedly untangle an international supply chain powered by billions of dollars and entire jungles. You drift into a community meeting where residents beg for more patrols while simultaneously begging for fewer arrests. Parents want safety without harassment. Kids want freedom without fear. Officers sit stiffly in folding chairs, nodding, unsure how to reconcile expectations that contradict each other. Everyone wants the crisis to end. No one knows how to do it without causing 10 new problems in the process. And looming above all of this is the crushing reality. Crack isn't just a drug. It's an economic engine, a coping mechanism, a symptom of neglect, and a business model flourishing in the vacuum left by failed policies. The police are trained to fight crime, not to solve poverty, unemployment, broken housing systems, generational trauma, or the absence of opportunity. They show up to scenes born from problems they were never equipped to fix. You stand in the doorway of yet another raid. Officers pour in, shouting commands, securing rooms, cuffing suspects. The operation feels surgical, precise, but outside on the sidewalk 2 kids watch silently. One will step into the very role vacated by the person now being loaded into the squad car. The cycle keeps turning, indifferent to badges or bulletproof vests. Later that night, you drift through the city as patrol cars roam the streets, lights spinning lazily. The officers inside look exhausted, not physically, exactly, but existentially. They're fighting a hydra with missing instructions, a war without a battlefield, a storm without shelter. And as dawn creeps in, you finally understand the streets couldn't be controlled because control was never the issue. The system itself was broken, and the people sent to fix it were never given the tools to do so. You meet kids who should be doing homework but are instead navigating a microeconomy shaped by desperation, unemployment, and the irresistible lure of fast profit. You stand on a corner where a 15-year-old boy, who still has the round cheeks of someone who should be learning algebra, adjusts his jacket and scans the block with the practiced vigilance of a small business owner. He's memorized shift changes, police routes, the habits of customers, and which adults are likely to complain. He is not playing grown-up. He's performing it out of necessity. And behind him, other kids move through alleyways and stairwells, conducting transactions with the seriousness of overworked accountants. You drift into one of their informal meetings, if you can even call it that. 3 teenagers sit on an overturned milk crate, calculating profits with a pen that barely works. They discuss supply, pricing and risk as casually as someone debating where to get lunch. You realise with a sickening clarity that these kids have absorbed the logic of the underground economy because no one bothered giving them access to the above-ground one. There are no summer jobs, no after-school programs, no internships waiting at the end of a bus route. There is only this, a chance to make in a day what their parents might make in a week. Let's talk margins. Crack is cheap to buy in bulk, easy to break down and quick to sell. A single teenager can move dozens of rocks in an evening, each transaction taking seconds. Cash flows like water. And when you're 14, 15, 16, when you've never seen money move this fast before, it feels like the universe finally handed you the cheat code everyone else was born with. But the cost is steep. You watch one kid slip a small baggie to a customer while keeping his eyes locked on a nearby doorway. He's learned to read danger the way most kids read comic books. Sirens, rival dealers, angry adults, unpredictable customers, every moment is a gamble. And yet, despite the danger, despite the fear, he keeps going. Because the alternative is nothing, or worse, hopelessness. You drift through a cramped apartment where a 13-year-old counts a wad of bills, stacking them so neatly it almost looks wholesome. His mother sits at the kitchen table, pretending she doesn't know where the money came from, because confronting reality requires emotional energy she hasn't had in years. He asks if she wants help with rent. She says no. He leaves the cash on the table anyway. The underground economy grows because it fills a vacuum. Factories have shut down. Retail jobs pay barely enough for bus fare. Schools are overcrowded, underfunded, and clinging to outdated textbooks. Meanwhile, the crack trade offers structure, hierarchy, immediate financial gratification, and, ironically, a sense of belonging. Dealers train younger kids. Older teens mentor the new recruits. There are rules, roles, and consequences. It feels like a job, even if it shouldn't. You stroll through abandoned lots where lookouts perch on broken steps, whistling soft signals when police roll by. Some are barely tall enough to see over the railing. These kids aren't criminals in the way the media describes. They're labourers in a shadow economy created by forces far beyond their control. But the stakes for them are far higher than any after-school job. One wrong move, one betrayal, one arrest, and everything changes. You witness a raid. Officers flood the block. Teens scatter like startled birds, darting between cars, leaping fences, disappearing into houses where the lights immediately switch off. Those who get caught are loaded into squad cars, their faces a mixture of fear, shame, and resignation. They're kids, but the system processes them like adults because the laws were written during panic, not reflection. Later, as dust settles, the block resets itself. New lookouts, new dealers, new recruits who should be worried about gym class tomorrow. The underground economy regenerates with unsettling efficiency because the conditions that birthed it remain unchanged. As you drift away, the weight of it sinks in. These kids aren't villains. They're entrepreneurs in a collapsing economy. They're survivors in a system that forgot them. And for many, crack dealing isn't rebellion. It's the only door that was ever open. Here, you feel the complicated, painful truth. The epidemic's damage is not just chemical but structural, wrapped in decades of economic neglect and racist policy-making. You walk into a neighbourhood where history hangs in the air like humidity, dense, heavy, unavoidable. Before crack ever arrived, these communities were already navigating uphill battles, redlining that dictated where black families could live, school districts starved of funding, factories that closed their doors and never reopened, and a job market where resumes with the wrong zip code were quietly shuffled to the bottom of the pile. Crack didn't fall into a vacuum. It fell into a wound. You pass a row of houses, some worn, some boarded, others still holding on with chipped paint and pride. Kids ride bikes along cracked sidewalks. Elderly neighbours sit on stoops, keeping watch the way generations before them did. There's beauty here, strength, a rhythm that doesn't break. But beneath it all is tension, a sense that the community has been balancing on a tightrope for decades, and the rope is beginning to fray. Crack hits these neighbourhoods like a storm that arrives while another storm is already in progress. You drift into a living room where a family gathers around the television watching news coverage that shows their own block framed as a danger zone. The commentary is cold, detached. The footage zooms in on the chaos but never on the context. Nobody mentions the factories that left, or the health clinics that closed, or the discriminatory housing practices that shaped the map like a cruel joke. The story begins with crack, because acknowledging what came before would require accountability. You walk past the corner store where business has slowed. People are afraid to linger too long. A mother ushers her children home in quick steps, glancing over her shoulder not at her neighbours but at the uncertainty that crack has introduced. It's not just the drug itself, it's the violence it attracts, the instability it fuels, the trust it erodes. Suddenly, the block feels smaller, tighter, harder to breathe in. Then come the police. Not the community officers who knew people by name. Those were cut years ago due to budget restructuring. Instead, you see aggressive, sweeping patrols, cruisers rolling through like occupying forces, helicopters buzz overhead, officers jump out in groups, hands already hovering near holsters. It's policing shaped not by partnership but by fear and the assumption that everyone here, child or adult, is a suspect. You walk into a home where a teenager sits at the kitchen table, listening to adults talk about yet another young man arrested. Some were dealers, some weren't, but all of them face the same unforgiving system. Mandatory minimums, the 100-to-1 sentencing rule, the near certainty of a criminal record that will follow them for life. Crack didn't just take people. The justice system swept up everyone around it like a net cast too wide. And the absence of men, of fathers, of brothers, becomes its own echo. You see mothers working 2 jobs, raising entire households alone. Grandparents becoming parents again. Younger children growing up with a framed photograph in the living room where a person should be sitting. Still, even amidst crisis, resilience weaves itself through the community like thread stitching torn fabric. Churches organise meal drives. Teachers stay late. Neighbours form watch groups, not against each other, but for each other. You can feel the determination. We will not be defined by this. It's quiet, steady, unbroken. But the structural harm remains undeniable. Crack's impact wasn't just chemical, it was political, social, economic. It deepened divides that had been carved long before the first rock ever hit the streets. The media blamed the communities themselves, never the policies that created vulnerability. And the country moved forward carrying a distorted image of black neighbourhoods that persists even today. As you step back from the street, you feel the weight of it all. A crisis layered atop another crisis, intertwined until they look inseparable. Because when history tells the story of crack, it often forgets the story of the people who bore the brunt, and they deserved better long before the first spark hit the ground. You float into the suburbs where powder cocaine use continues quietly behind closed doors, untouched by the hysteria shaping policy in the cities. Here, the lawns are trimmed, the minivans washed, and the mailboxes politely upright. The air smells faintly of barbecues, sprinkler systems, and the lingering belief that everything is fine. You drift past a 2-story colonial with shutters painted in a colour called something like autumn willow, and inside a group of adults in pastel clothing are casually dipping into a little bag of powder cocaine as if they're sampling a new artisanal spice. There is no panic here, no news vans, no police raids. Powder cocaine in the suburbs isn't a crisis, it's a hobby. A recreational garnish sprinkled onto dinner parties, corporate retreats, and PTA events hosted by people who claim they only drink socially. You watch a man in a sweater vest tell his friends he uses cocaine for focus, even though he is currently talking at a speed that suggests he hasn't blinked since 1978. Let's talk dissonance. While crack cocaine fuels headlines, moral outrage, and militarised policing in the inner city, powder cocaine sits quietly on granite countertops beside artisanal cheeses. The same substance, chemically near identical, is treated like 2 entirely different phenomena depending on geography, economics, and who happens to be holding it. You drift into a kitchen where a group stands around an island the size of a modest studio apartment. Someone laughs softly, brushing a thin line of powder off the marble surface with a credit card that has an airline rewards program. The conversation flows easily, from office politics to vacation homes to which contractor does the best basement renovations. No one is afraid. No one is judged. No one is being arrested. Powder cocaine here is framed as indulgence, not danger. Meanwhile, the TV in the next room hums with news coverage describing urban drug use as a moral catastrophe. The guests glance at the screen briefly, shake their heads in performative sadness, and then return to their powder without a hint of irony. It's not hypocrisy exactly, it's insulation. The suburbs operate under the unspoken rule. As long as the lawn is tidy, nothing is really wrong. You drift into a corporate office park where executives use cocaine in bathroom stalls to get through 14-hour workdays. They call it stress management. Human resources calls it none of our business. Everyone moves on. And here's the most uncomfortable part. The legal system moves on too. When Suburban users are caught, which is already rare, they receive treatment recommendations, sealed records, sympathetic headlines, and a reassuring pat on the shoulder from the judge. The narrative frames them as talented, promising individuals who lost their way temporarily. You wander down a cul-de-sac where teens sneak powder cocaine borrowed from their parents' medicine cabinets, not out of desperation, but out of curiosity. They hide it between SAT tutors and lacrosse practice. Their mistakes are handled quietly, discreetly. Nobody panics because the neighbourhood association has rules, and acknowledging this would clash with the community's dedication to seasonal wreaths and tasteful porch lighting. This isn't to say the suburbs are immune to harm. Cocaine addiction still takes a toll on marriages, careers, mental health, but the fallout happens behind walls thick enough to muffle any sense of urgency. It's easier to pretend that real drug problems exist elsewhere, somewhere noisier, somewhere less landscaped. And that's the divide the crack epidemic deepened. Not chemical, but cultural. Powder cocaine is treated as an expensive quirk. Crack is treated as a public enemy. One gets therapy, the other gets prison time. Geography becomes destiny. Privilege becomes insulation. As you float above the quiet cul-de-sacs, you notice one more thing. The suburbs feel eerily calm. Too calm. Like a pond with frantic things happening just below the surface. Powder cocaine use never explodes into national hysteria because it doesn't align with America's preferred narrative of who should be criminalized and who should be quietly forgiven. The people here watch the crisis from afar, sad, troubled, concerned, even as they dip into the very same substance. It's not hypocrisy. It's inequality with a driveway. It's election season, and you watch candidates compete to see who can sound toughest on crime while ignoring the root causes entirely. You drift into a brightly lit debate stage where 3 candidates in stiff suits stand behind podiums that look like they were purchased from the authoritative furniture section of a catalogue. The moderator asks a simple question about drug policy, and suddenly every candidate straightens their spine, clears their throat, and launches into a monologue about the moral decay threatening our great nation. Their voices tremble with patriotic fervour. Their arms gesture dramatically. And absolutely none of them mention poverty, housing policy, funding for schools, or any factor that would make an actual sociologist scream into a pillow. One candidate promises to restore law and order while pounding the podium as if attempting to summon thunder. Another vows to take back our streets, even though the streets in question are nowhere near their own district. A third insists they alone will crush the crack epidemic with the iron fist of justice, which would be inspiring if it were not also the tagline of a dystopian video game. Let's talk about incentives. Politicians love a villain, not a complex one. Complexity requires nuance, and nuance does not poll well. They want a villain who can be described in a 5-second soundbite and printed on a bumper sticker. Crack cocaine becomes that villain, not the socio-economic collapse surrounding it, not the underfunded public services, not the lack of healthcare, childcare, job training or opportunity. Just the drug itself, neat, simple, useful. You float into campaign headquarters where advisors huddle around polling data with the intensity of gamblers studying horse races. A strategist circles phrases like tough on crime and zero tolerance with a thick red marker. Someone nods approvingly, Someone else claps. No one asks whether these policies will actually work. That is a question for after the election, which is practically never. Then come the commercials. You watch a television flicker to life with grainy nighttime footage of city alleys and sirens. Ominous music plays, the kind used in movies when the monster approaches. A narrator, with a voice like scorched gravel, announces that Candidate A will fight back, while Candidate B is portrayed as someone who would personally hand out drugs at recess. The ad ends with a slow-motion flag waving majestically in the wind, because nothing says thoughtful policy like stirring nationalism set to stock music. Meanwhile, you drift into a living room where a family watches these ads between sitcom reruns. They absorb the message: crime is out of control, drugs are everywhere, and the only solution is to elect someone who promises more punishment. They do not hear a single suggestion about after-school programs, affordable housing, community investment, or job creation. Nobody talks about improving mental health services or expanding addiction treatment. Those topics are too big, too slow, too honest. And honesty does not win elections. You step into a press conference where a candidate triumphantly reveals a new bill increasing minimum sentences. Cameras flash, reporters scribble, the crowd applauds. No one asks whether mandatory minimums have ever been shown to reduce drug use. Spoiler, they haven't. But the bill sounds strong, and sounding strong is more important than being effective. You drift into communities watching this unfold with exhausted disbelief. They feel the policies long before election day. They feel them when unarmed cousins are frisked, when police surge into blocks already drowning in surveillance, when judges hand out decade-long sentences for grams, not kilos, when their neighbourhoods become political playing fields rather than places where people live. For politicians, the crack epidemic becomes a branding opportunity, an arena where being tough matters more than being humane. Crime becomes currency, fear becomes leverage, and policy becomes performance art. As you float away from the roaring crowds and patriotic campaign signs, one truth settles gently over you. No one can fix what they refuse to understand. And in the 1980s and 90s, many politicians weren't trying to understand the crack epidemic. They were trying to win it. You meet women, exhausted, determined, furious, who decide they're done watching their neighbourhoods spiral and begin grassroots movements no one expected. You drift into a living room where a circle of mothers sits on mismatched chairs, the kind collected over decades of family gatherings, hand-me-downs and yard sales. There's coffee brewing, strong enough to revive the dead, and a plate of cookies no one is touching because the room vibrates with purpose, not snacks. These women have spent years holding their families together through chaos, and you can feel the moment they collectively snap into resolve. It's quiet but solid, like the first click of a lock being undone. One woman slams her hand gently, but firmly on the table. She's done watching kids in her building disappear into crack houses. Another says she's done calling 911 and waiting for help that always shows up too late. A third wipes her eyes and says she's tired of hearing families whisper about addiction in hallways, as if silence could save anyone. You realise you're witnessing the birth of a movement, not polished, not funded, not strategically branded. Just raw human determination in its purest form. They start small because small is what they can afford. Phone trees, door knocks, flyers printed at church, walking kids to school in organised groups so they don't have to pass the same corners alone. They meet after work, after dinner, after helping with homework, after doing everything else expected of them. Their activism is squeezed into the hours when most people are already asleep. You drift into another neighbourhood meeting, this time held in a church basement, where the fluorescent lighting flickers like it's trying to escape. Dozens of mothers gather, some with infants on their hips, others with teenagers slumped in the back rows pretending they don't care even though they do. They discuss abandoned buildings that need to be boarded up, block watches to establish, and how to protect kids from dealers who know every blind spot in the system. The energy is fierce, organised chaos. One woman suggests marching to City Hall. Another volunteers to write letters to newspapers. Someone else brings up lobbying for treatment centres. A grandmother stands up and says, in a voice that could move mountains, "If politicians won't fix this, then we will." Everyone claps loudly, not because the basement has good acoustics, but because hope suddenly feels tangible, and then the media notices. But not in the usual sensational way. Reporters flock to these gatherings surprised and slightly confused to find mothers leading anti-drug patrols, organising midnight walks, escorting strangers' children home because their own parents are missing, arrested, or struggling. Cameras capture lines of women in matching t-shirts, chanting on courthouse steps with handmade signs about funding, fairness, treatment, and dignity. Their voices echo, clear, powerful, impossible to ignore. Their work isn't glamorous. It doesn't come with grants or glossy brochures. It's walking blocks at midnight with flashlights. It's standing outside crack houses demanding the dealers leave. It's calling politicians relentlessly until someone's assistant begs them to stop. It's burying children. It's saving others. It's cooking extra food because the neighbour's cupboard is empty. It's tough love, gentle care, and volcanic anger rolled into one. You drift into a community centre where mothers host support groups, packed rooms full of tears, laughter, and people trying desperately to understand how to pull their families back together. They talk about relapse, recovery, forgiveness, and the crushing guilt of not being able to save everyone. Some mothers are caring for grandkids while their own children battle addiction. Others advocate tirelessly for treatment over prison. All of them share one unspoken truth. They refuse to give up. Politicians visit these meetings eventually. Some are sincere. Some are seeking photo ops. All of them look startled when confronted by women who have stronger organisational skills than half their staff. The mothers hand them lists, demands really, written on lined notebook paper with bullet points that might as well be legislative drafts. More funding for treatment centres, better school programmes, job training opportunities, safer housing, mental health services, things that should have already existed. You float away from these neighbourhoods with an unexpected feeling, awe, because amid the devastation of the crack epidemic, the most powerful resistance didn't come from polished speeches, police raids, or federal task forces. It came from mothers who refused to let their communities die. Mothers who fought with nothing but grit, grief, and the unshakable belief that saving even one child was worth every sleepless night. A crisis created the echoes, but the mothers created the fight. You drift through the construction of new prisons, updated laws, and entire industries built on the expectation that the crisis would never end. You watch bulldozers roll across empty fields like prehistoric beasts clearing land for something no one should be proud of. Concrete foundations pour into the earth, steel bars rise like skeletal ribs, and rows of cells take shape with assembly line efficiency. The air hums with the sound of construction, drills, hammers, generators, each beat spelling out a quiet truth. Someone decided cages were easier to build than solutions. Step inside the newly built facility and you see it everywhere. Gleaming floors, freshly painted walls, and staff walking tours as if showing off a new model home. State of the art, they say. Much needed, they say. Nobody mentions that the state-of-the-art rooms are 8 by 10 feet, and the much-needed part was manufactured by mandatory minimums and sentencing laws that exploded prison populations faster than anyone could track. You float through legislative halls where lawmakers proudly wave bills that promise safety but read like blueprints for incarceration on an industrial scale. More funding for prison expansion, harsher penalties, more offences classified as felonies. Meanwhile, the budget for treatment programs slinks quietly into the corner like an embarrassed guest at a party where it doesn't belong. Let's look at the numbers. They grow so fast they practically sprout wings. Prison populations balloon throughout the 1980s and 90s, driven not by actual crime waves, but by policy waves. Laws that send first-time crack offenders away for decades, while people caught with powder cocaine walk out with probation and a stern lecture about responsibility. It's like watching two people commit the same misstep and only one gets launched into space for it. You drift into a boardroom where private prison executives speak with the hushed excitement of people who have discovered a business opportunity hiding behind tragedy. They talk about bed space, population forecasts, and long-term contracts the way gardeners talk about spring planting. You feel queasy. These are not services being built for rehabilitation. These are products being prepared for demand. And the demand is enormous because sentencing laws ensured it. Young men arrested for tiny quantities of crack receive sentences measured not in months but in decades. You follow them through intake processes, paperwork, bag checks, metal detectors. You watch their names become numbers, their clothes replaced with uniforms, their futures converted into schedules controlled by buzzers and guards. Their absence echoes back home. You drift into a living room where a mother sits with a letter from her son, carefully unfolding it like fragile glass. She reads it out loud, stops halfway, presses her fingers to her eyes, then continues. The prison he's in wasn't built for violent predators as the campaign ads claimed. It was built for kids like him, caught in a net cast too wide, held in place by laws written in panic. Meanwhile, the prison economy grows. Entire rural towns come to depend on correctional facilities for jobs. Healthcare companies sign contracts to provide in-prison services. Construction firms lobby for more funding. Politicians tour new buildings and congratulate themselves on progress. In a grim twist, these institutions become economic lifelines for communities nowhere near the neighbourhoods devastated by crack. You drift through a prison yard as men shovel snow, sweep sidewalks, or stand silently in clusters. Some were caught selling, some were caught using, some were just caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Their lives bend around these walls, relationships strained, opportunities vanished, years irretrievably lost. Rehabilitation is promised on paper but rarely delivered. The system was built to hold bodies, not to help them. Back outside, you float high above the country and see the pattern clearly. A nation responding to crisis with construction, not compassion. With punishment, not prevention. The prison system didn't coincidentally expand during the crack epidemic. It grew because the laws made it profitable, the policies made it inevitable, and the panic made it politically irresistible. And as you drift away, you feel the heaviness of it all. The modern prison system wasn't just built with concrete and steel. It was built with fear, misperception, and the quiet assumption that certain lives were easier to lock away than to lift up. As the 1990s arrive, you watch usage fall, not because of the war on drugs, but because of economic changes, community action, and shifts in drug preferences. You float into a neighbourhood that once pulsed with the frantic energy of the crack trade, but now, slowly, quietly, feels different. Not fixed, not healed, just shifting. The air holds less tension. The corners once crowded with dealers are less busy. The abandoned houses are still there, but a few now have boarded windows, fresh padlocks, or signs that the city finally remembered they existed. The chaos hasn't vanished. It's just begun to lose momentum. Part of it is economics. You drift past younger dealers who would have been recruited a decade earlier, but now shrug and say the profit margins aren't what they used to be. Supply chains change, prices fluctuate. New drugs enter the market and compete for customers in the same grim Darwinian way trends cycle through social media today. Dealers chase higher returns elsewhere. Crack, once the centerpiece of an entire underground economy, starts feeling outdated, like an old gadget everyone suddenly decided was uncool. Part of the decline comes from community action you've already witnessed. You see mothers patrolling neighborhoods, churches organizing late-night walks, block associations calling out problem houses and pushing the city to shut them down. HIV outreach programs expand. Drug education becomes more honest. Needle exchanges and harm reduction tactics begin to gain traction. Quiet efforts that rarely make headlines but absolutely alter lives. The people most affected by the crisis refuse to wait for government solutions that never arrive. They do it themselves. But the biggest shift is cultural. Crack, once falsely glamorized in some corners, becomes universally feared. You watch teenagers in the 90s shake their heads with horror when the drug is mentioned. Its devastation too visible, too personal, too close to home. They've seen parents vanish into addiction. They've watched friends spiral. They've heard the sirens, the arguments, the silence afterward. Crack becomes a cautionary tale no one wants to become part of. Even those curious about drugs steer towards something else. Marijuana, ecstasy, anything with less devastation attached. You drift through police precincts where officers still run raids but privately acknowledge the cases are fewer. Not gone, never gone, but declining. Patrol cars drive the same routes out of habit, but the streets have changed beneath them. Younger officers hear the stories from older colleagues like legends from another era. You should have seen it back then. They nod, unsure whether to feel grateful or uneasy. In treatment centres, you see a different kind of shift. More people are seeking help, not because stigma has vanished, but because survival sometimes softens pride. Counsellors, many of them former users, sit with patients who are exhausted, reflective, ready to reclaim pieces of themselves. Recovery becomes less of a whispered hope and more of a reachable one. You walk into a classroom where teachers talk about how attendance has improved, how some students finally seem less distracted, less frightened, less burdened. It's not a miracle, it's a thaw, a slow warming after a long winter. But make no mistake, the damage remains. You pass block after block still bearing scars, buildings left empty, families missing members, opportunities lost to years of fear and instability. Decline does not mean disappearance. It means the crisis shrinks enough that the world stops paying attention, even though the people who live through it never get that luxury. You drift into a home where a teenager flips through old photographs, pictures of relatives who were there one year and gone the next. She doesn't speak. She just looks at the faces, memorizing the people she barely got to know. Healing, here, is not loud. It's quiet, slow, uneven. And as the decade rolls forward, the country shifts its attention to new fears, new substances, new headlines. The crack epidemic, once treated as an unstoppable force, becomes something policymakers politely distance themselves from, rarely acknowledging what truly caused it or what finally made it fade. You float above the neighbourhood once more. It looks calmer, not fixed, but changed. The storm didn't end because it was defeated. It ended because people, ordinary people, held on long enough for it to lose strength. You stand among adults who grew up in the chaos, still navigating consequences that policymakers never bothered to foresee. You wander into a neighbourhood block party where the music is upbeat, the grills are going and kids chase each other through sprinklers. It looks joyful, normal even, until you begin listening to the stories beneath the laughter. These are adults who were once children hiding under blankets during late-night raids, stepping over needles on the way to school, memorizing police siren patterns like lullabies. They learned too early how to read danger in someone's eyes and how to build emotional armor out of whatever scraps of stability they could find. Now they're trying to build lives that don't collapse under the weight of what they survived. You pause beside a man in his 30s who jokes easily with friends, but later admits he still double-checks the locks every night, not because anything is happening now, but because everything used to. Trauma lingers like smoke. Even after the fire is out, the scent stays in the walls. He talks about friends who never made it to adulthood, about families splintered by addiction, about school years clouded by instability. He's successful now, but the path here was paved through obstacles people outside his community never had to imagine. You drift into a therapist's office where a woman sits with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was a child during the height of the epidemic, one of the good kids, everyone said. The one who avoided trouble, the one who always did her homework. Yet she carries a heaviness as she describes growing up with a parent who vanished for days at a time. She learned to make her own meals before she learned multiplication. She learned to soothe her younger siblings long before she learned to soothe herself. She's only now realizing that what she called being strong was actually survival mode. These are the invisible scars, emotional, psychological, generational. Not the kind that show up on X-rays, but the kind that shape how someone trusts, loves, worries, rests, or doesn't rest at all. You step into a school filled with adults who were once those middle schoolers navigating broken systems. Many of them return as teachers, counselors, or coaches, determined to break cycles they once felt trapped in. They're patient with students who act out because they recognize the signs. They see themselves in the anger, the confusion, the withdrawn silence. They know that misbehavior is often a message disguised as trouble. They know because they once spoke that same language. You float through a community centre where adults in their 40s and 50s gather for a support group that isn't officially called We Grew Up during the crack epidemic, but it might as well be. They talk about guilt, survivor's guilt, family guilt, societal guilt. They talk about resilience fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from years of being praised for making it out when making it out required losing pieces of themselves along the way. They talk about their children and how they want them to have something better, something softer. And then there are the reunions that never happen. The fathers who never returned from prison, the mothers whose addiction swallowed years that cannot be recovered, the siblings scattered across foster systems like paperwork no one bothered to file correctly. Adults today are still stitching together family histories full of gaps, silences, and unanswered questions. Yet for all the sorrow woven into their stories, there is strength too. Quiet, durable, astonishing. Many have built stable homes from foundations that were once cracked, literally and figuratively. They advocate for better policies, volunteer at local programs, vote with intention, raise children with tenderness they weren't always shown. Still, the aftermath remains. Higher incarceration rates, generational poverty, lingering stigma, neighbourhoods left underfunded long after the crisis faded from headlines, adults who still jump when they hear loud noises or tense when they walk past boarded buildings because the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. You drift away slowly, watching these adults carry invisible scars with visible grace. They survived a crisis they didn't create, navigated policies designed without them in mind, and grew into a generation that understands resilience not as a point of pride, but as a responsibility inherited too young. The epidemic may have declined, but its echoes walk with them every day, and those echoes still deserve to be heard. Finally, you return to that simple ingredient in your pantry, now forever linked to a crisis that altered laws, cities, and countless lives, proving that even the mildest substances can spark history's loudest storms. You open the cupboard again, staring at the familiar orange box. It sits there innocently beside the sugar, flour, and that mysterious jar whose label wore off sometime in 2014. Baking soda hasn't changed. It hasn't grown fangs or demanded a rebrand. It's still used to calm heartburn, clean sinks, and deodorize your fridge, just a quiet multitasker minding its own business. And yet, history slapped a second resume onto it. Co-conspirator in a national crisis. You can almost hear it sighing. I didn't ask for this. You drift into kitchens across decades, modest ones, cluttered ones, spotless ones you would never dare cook in. Baking soda is always there, wedged between spices or tucked behind canned soup. It was supposed to be the ultimate helper product, a humble powder that helped dough rise, soothed bee stings, and extinguished grease fires. But in the 1980s, it stumbled into a context it was spectacularly unqualified for, the chemistry of addiction. And that's the strange part. The ingredient itself didn't change. People did. Circumstances did. Systems did. Baking soda didn't wake up one morning and decide to join the illicit economy. It was simply nearby, cheap, accessible, and chemically compatible with cocaine in a way that made everything spiral. Sometimes history doesn't need villains, it just needs a catalyst quietly sitting in aisle 3. You drift into a grocery store where shoppers push carts without realizing they're passing one of the most controversial ingredients in American history. No one gasps, no one clutches their pearls. A toddler even grabs a box and waves it around joyfully, unaware that this same product once helped reshape entire cities. It's surreal, watching something so ordinary carry such extraordinary weight depending on which timeline you're peeking into. Meanwhile, the consequences radiate outward. You walk through neighborhoods forever marked by the epidemic, places where new murals cover old scars, where community gardens bloom beside buildings that sat abandoned for years, where resilience feels woven into the sidewalks. Residents still carry the memories, families fractured, trust broken, opportunities erased, and somehow through it all, that same pantry ingredient remains part of the story, like an accidental signature left on a document no one meant to sign. Politicians still mention the crack era in speeches, often without acknowledging the socio-economic tinderbox the drug landed in. Historians still debate policies born from panic. Sociologists trace the ripple effects across generations. Meanwhile, baking soda continues to sit quietly in cupboards, helping cookies rise and laundry stay bright. Nothing about its original purpose changed, but the world around it did. You drift into a science classroom where students learn about acids, bases, and chemical reactions. The teacher mentions sodium bicarbonate's versatility, its ability to foam, fizz, neutralize, and transform. The kids marvel. They see magic. And they're not wrong. Chemistry is magic. But as history proved, magic can go sideways when mixed with desperation, inequality, and a drug epidemic no one was prepared for. Then you step into a town hall where community leaders discuss reparative efforts, re-entry programs, sentencing reforms, restorative justice. They know that the crisis was never really about a white powder or a beige powder. It was about systems bending to breaking, about communities left unsupported, about choices shaped by environments rather than individual failings. And as you float back home, back to your quiet pantry, your quiet cupboard, your quiet box of baking soda, you feel the strange juxtaposition settle over you. So ordinary, so harmless, so deeply entangled in a chapter of American history that reshaped policy, policing, media, and family structures. No one wanted this legacy for baking soda. Not chemists, not communities, certainly not the ingredient itself, which would frankly prefer to be known only for helping muffins achieve their full potential. But history doesn't ask permission. It grabs what's available: objects, people, neighborhoods, and pulls them into stories they never volunteered for. And sometimes that story begins with something sitting quietly on your kitchen shelf, waiting to be part of something far larger than it ever imagined. You drift into the fluorescent lit corridors of 1980s universities, where economists, criminologists, and sociologists gather around chalkboards like wizards arguing over potions. Each insists they've cracked the code of why crack spread, why it didn't stop, and why no one can agree on anything. You, sitting quietly in the corner with a notebook, realise the experts are just as confused as everyone else. They just use fancier words for it. Step into the seminar room. A group of professors clutching coffee mugs, each emblazoned with a slightly smug academic slogan like causality, greater than correlation, debates loudly over declining job markets, housing instability, global supply chains, and whether human beings even make rational decisions. One economist draws a graph so complicated it begins to resemble a plate of spaghetti. A sociologist counters with a flowchart containing more arrows than a medieval battle. A criminologist insists none of them understand street-level dynamics, though he himself hasn't set foot on an actual street corner since the Carter administration. You sit back, watching ideas fly across the table like poorly aimed magical spells. One scholar blames globalization, another blames poverty, another blames broken families, and a fourth says everything circles back to neoliberal economic restructuring. A fifth announces confidently that the whole epidemic can be explained using game theory. You check your notes and write. Apparently the 1980s were a board game. Then comes the bickering over data. Crime statistics spike in one study, dip in another, suddenly reverse in a third. Everyone blames the methodology. The criminologist rolls his eyes so hard they almost detach. Someone mutters that the sample size was too small. Someone else suggests we may need longitudinal data. A philosopher wandering past the doorway overhears and immediately says, "But what is data?" "Really?" The room groans. Let's talk motives. These scholars aren't malicious, they're just desperate to explain the inexplicable. The crack epidemic is spreading faster than traditional theories can keep up with. Neighbourhoods are changing faster than studies can be completed. By the time an academic publishes a paper, the street conditions it describes have already evolved into something entirely new, like trying to write a field guide to lightning. You drift through the sociology department where two professors are mid-argument about whether crack dealing represents deviant behaviour, rational economic adaptation, subcultural formation, or all three simultaneously. You write in your notebook, "Yes." Next door, an economist passionately argues that crack's low price created elastic demand, prompting a criminologist to slam a textbook down and declare that human suffering cannot be reduced to elasticity curves. In the back, a lone graduate student nods while silently questioning every life decision that brought them here. Then you float into the psychology wing, where another group debates trauma, addiction, environmental stresses, and whether the crack epidemic can be fully understood without factoring in childhood development. Someone draws the human brain on a whiteboard with arrows pointing everywhere like an overworked subway map. You add another note. Everything is connected and no one knows how. Despite the chaos, something meaningful emerges. Everyone is right and everyone is wrong. Crack did not spread because of one factor. It spread because of dozens: economic decline, housing discrimination, policing patterns, political choices, social disinvestment, global trade routes, and yes, the chemistry of a drug that hit too fast and too hard. The academics argue not because they're clueless, but because the truth is unbearably complex. You drift into a faculty lounge where exhausted professors slump into armchairs. One admits, we still don't have a unified theory. Another shrugs and says, we probably never will. A third sighs and whispers, but at least our job security is excellent. And that's when you finally understand. The experts aren't supposed to have a single answer. They're supposed to illuminate all the tangled threads that policymakers ignored. They're supposed to ask questions that make solutions more humane, more grounded, more realistic. Yet as you leave the university halls, your notebook full of diagrams that look like abstract art, you realise something comforting. Even the smartest people in the room can be baffled by history, and sometimes acknowledging complexity is the most honest answer of all. Now you find yourself wandering through corporate boardrooms where executives sip coffee, glance at cocaine-related headlines and think, interesting. While the street market for crack explodes, pharmaceutical companies quietly prepare their own empire of stimulants, legal and profitable. You watch them nod thoughtfully, as if taking notes on human behaviour for later use, because they absolutely are. You float into a conference room decorated in that timeless, expensive but emotionally empty style that only corporations truly master. Long table, polished wood, a succulent that is somehow both alive and dead. Executives sit in ergonomic chairs, flipping through newspapers detailing the chaos unfolding in America's cities. They read about addiction, violence, economic devastation. They read about crack rock selling faster than anyone can enforce laws against them. And instead of panicking, they sip their coffee, raise their eyebrows and murmur, "Fascinating market demand curve." It's not that they're rooting for the crisis, it's that they see something else entirely. A stimulant-hungry world. A population desperate for focus, energy, relief, escape, whatever chemical assistance can provide. And pharmaceutical companies, unlike street dealers, don't have to worry about raids at dawn. They have lab coats, lobbyists, FDA paperwork. They have patience. You drift closer as an executive flips to the business section, where buried among earnings reports is a tiny article about the expanding use of prescription stimulants, attention disorders, fatigue, depression, narcolepsy, productivity. A market is forming, not illicit, chaotic and violent like crack, but polished, medicalized and ready for branding. One executive taps the page meaningfully, and the others nod like conspirators at a polite tea party. Meanwhile, in laboratories across the country, chemists in clean white coats are perfecting formulations of amphetamines and methylphenidate. They're not mixing powders on street corners. They're filtering, refining, testing, packaging. Clipboards in hand, overhead lights humming. The whole operation feels like crack's extremely organised cousin. You wander past lab benches covered in vials and chromatography charts, and you can almost hear the unspoken motto, "We can do stimulants better." Legally. Let's talk marketing. While the government wages war in the streets, pharmaceutical companies wage campaigns in doctors' offices. Representatives in crisp suits bring glossy brochures featuring smiling people, holding briefcases, jogging, studying, living their most productive lives. The message is clear. These stimulants aren't scary. They're professional, refined, prescribed, medically sanctioned bursts of energy. You drift into a doctor's waiting room where pamphlets neatly explain fatigue disorders and attention challenges in soothing pastel colours. There are no fear-driven headlines here, no grainy footage of raids, just calm assurances that certain pills may help you stay focused, stay awake, stay on track. The contrast to the street market couldn't be sharper, and yet, in quiet ways, the two worlds overlap. You see researchers studying addiction patterns, not to solve the crack crisis directly, but to understand the brain well enough to design drugs that can be used daily without raising eyebrows. You see executives analysing which demographics respond best to which stimulants. You see legal teams reviewing regulations, spotting loopholes, crafting language that positions their products as safe, stable alternatives to the chaos dominating nightly news. In one boardroom, An executive slides a bar graph across the table showing rising rates of adult ADHD diagnoses. Another shows workplace productivity reports. Another highlights a growing cultural obsession with efficiency, long hours, and hustle. The room hums with possibility. Not the sinister kind, just the pragmatic realization that society is ready to embrace stimulants, as long as they come in bottles with child-proof caps and doctor signatures. You drift out of the boardroom and into the broader world. Schools begin adopting stricter academic expectations. Workplaces demand more output. The cultural drumbeat grows louder. Perform, focus, achieve. Stimulants shift from fringe to mainstream, from taboo to normalized. And through it all, pharmaceutical companies thrive. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly, like ivy growing up a wall. Meanwhile, crack's devastation remains in the public eye, its consequences etched into entire neighborhoods. But the stimulant story bifurcates. One branch punished, demonized, controlled, the other medicalized, advertised, embraced. You float back to that sterile conference room one last time. The executives gather their papers, they straighten their ties. Someone casually jokes, "Imagine if the public knew how similar some of these molecules are." The room chuckles, not guiltily, just knowingly, because they understand something that took everyone else decades to realize. The human desire for energy, focus, and escape doesn't disappear. It just changes packaging. And so tonight, as you lie back and let your mind drift, we close the chapter on a story that somehow began with a leaf, passed through a laboratory, and tumbled into an era that reshaped cities, policies, and entire generations. The history of crack cocaine isn't simple, or clean, or easy to look at. It's messy and human and full of the strange choices people make when money is tight, hope is thin, and the world feels tilted in the wrong direction. You've walked through the rise, the panic, the politics, and the quiet aftermath. You've seen communities bend under pressure they didn't create, and others rise with a kind of stubborn resilience that feels almost miraculous. It's a reminder of something oddly comforting. Even in the darkest decades, people adapt, rebuild, resist, and somehow find ways to laugh again. History may be full of disasters, but it's also full of people who refuse to be defined by them. The mothers who fought back, the neighborhoods that refused to stay broken, the activists, volunteers, and regular folks who looked around at the wreckage and said, "Okay, time to start sweeping." That's the part we often forget when we talk about the crack epidemic. The way healing quietly begins long before the headlines notice. The way human beings insist on clawing toward hope, even when the story seems impossibly heavy. So as you tuck into your clean bed tonight, with warm sheets, safe streets outside your window, and absolutely zero involvement from baking soda, maybe whisper a small thank you for all the modern comforts built on the backs of people who endured fear, confusion, and years of policy experiments gone sideways. Gratitude doesn't erase the past, but it makes the present feel a little softer, a little kinder. And maybe that's enough for now, because history, even the painful chapters, reminds us of something gentle. People survive, they rebuild, they learn, slowly and imperfectly, but they learn. And you, listening here in the dark, get to drift off knowing that you're part of a world still being shaped by thousands of small acts of resilience. Let that thought settle over you like a warm blanket as your breathing slows and your eyes get heavy. Tonight, let the noise of the past quiet down. Let the weight of everything you heard fade into the distance, and let yourself rest, peacefully, safely, deeply. The story's done for now. You've made it through the mess and the madness and the lessons tucked between them, and you're still here. Good night.